This video is sponsored by Squarespace. What's going on, guys? Billy here, and today we're going to be covering how to capture hyperlapse with your DJI Mini 3 Pro from start to finish. So this includes everything from the best settings to use, the pre-planning phase that goes into it, some of the different flight modes that make up the hyperlapse flight feature. We'll then get into the post-production phase, so the things that I do to kind of put my hyperlapse together and make it look good. And of course, along the way, we'll share some more tips and tricks on how to get the best looking hyperlapse possible. So one of DJI's newest intelligent flight modes on the block is hyperlapse, which was first introduced in the Mavic 2 Pro. So I guess saying that it's new is a stretch, as the Mavic 2 Pro is coming up on being 5 years old. It is, however, new to the Mini series of drones though, with the Mini 3 Pro being the first sub 250-gram drone that DJI makes that supports automated flight in general. As I mentioned in my focus track tutorial video, the reason behind this is the tri-directional obstacle avoidance system that is also a first in DJI's Mini drones. All of the sub 250-gram drones that predate the Mini 3 Pro had no obstacle avoidance whatsoever. Now, you probably already know this coming into this video, but a hyperlapse is basically a moving time lapse where the passage of time happens rapidly over a short distance traveled. For example, you can fly a half a mile very slowly in, say, the span of 30 minutes and then shrink that down to 15 seconds to make all of the movement on the ground look incredibly fast. The drone achieves this by automatically flying a predetermined route with many choices of planning, intervals, and speeds. On this route, it takes hundreds of photographs that are then combined into one short video. The way that I've found to capture the best looking hyperlapse is by including as much motion as possible. So I always like to get shots that show cars moving, and having some clouds moving definitely doesn't hurt as well. I'm always on the lookout for busy highways, interchanges, or beaches that also have a cool background. My philosophy is the more motion, the better. Now, the Mini 3 Pro specifically is such a great drone for capturing hyperlapses for 4 different reasons. It's got a great camera system, it's small, quiet, and inconspicuous, it's great at handling high gusts of wind, especially for its size, and probably the most important, especially to me, is its long flight time, especially with that upgraded battery with an estimated flight time of 47 minutes, but on the real, you're probably gonna get more like 40 minutes. Regardless, that is a really long time to fly, allowing you to capture longer hyperlapses. It's also great because it lets you capture vertical hyperlapses utilizing that new rotating camera design, so you can capture vertical frames that are better for sharing on Instagram, TikTok, or any other platform that favors portrait content. Okay, so now let's get into our tutorial on how to capture hyperlapses with the Mini 3 Pro. I'll go over everything from what we should think about before the flight, the best settings to use, how to use the different flight planning options, and then we'll go over how I go about editing my hyperlapses. So when it comes to actually creating your hyperlapse, there is so many different ways to do it, and that's what I love about these hyperlapses is that there's so many ways to be creative. You can change so many different aspects of your hyperlapse to get a different feel and a different look, from changing the interval to the speed to the different flight mode that you use to the different angles that you can shoot at. I mean, there's so many ways to be creative that it really does introduce a brand new way to capture photos and videos with your drone, because hyperlapses are like kind of this different subsection that are kind of photos, but they're also kind of a video. So it is really cool nonetheless. Now, I found that there's kind of 4 different ways that I go about capturing hyperlapses, more like 4 different feels to the videos that I go for. So I'll usually go with like a slower speed over a small distance. So like a small little rotation around a building, but have the cars whizzing by. That's always a cool look. I'll also go with a slow speed over a far distance. So if I'm trying to go down the span of, say, an interstate, I'll go really slow so the cars are moving incredibly fast, but I try to cover the whole entire distance of the interstate, at least the leg that I'm on. And that's a really good thing about having the Mini 3 Pro is its long flight time. So you can do slower speeds over longer distances. Also, sometimes I'll go with a faster speed over a far distance because you can capture a ton of area over, of course, a longer span of time. And the Mini 3 is also great for that because it's got a great transmission system. So the further you fly away, you're still going to have connection between the remote and your drone. And finally, I love to capture long exposure hyperlapses, but we'll get more into that towards the end. I'm going to give it its own sort of section again at the end of the video. So I typically start out with a planning flight where I get my settings in line, I plan my flight, fly around and scout out the area, and then I'll land. My reasoning behind this is because every second that you're in the air planning extending your hyperlapse, you're then taking away from the amount of time that you can actually capture your hyperlapse. So if you're in the air looking around for a good hyperlapse, you finally find one, you find a good angle, you set the drone up, you set your course for course lock, and you look, and your battery is at 75%. Well, now that limits how many photos you can take, and your hyperlapse is going to be shorter. So I, again, always like to do that exploratory flight. I fly around, see what I want to capture, land, and then try and start my hyperlapse immediately once I take off to get the most out of the battery that is in my drone. Now, inside of the app here are a few settings that I want to call your attention to. Once we select hyperlapse, we have a few options in regards to how our file is saved that can be found in the bottom right corner. In this menu, we can change how the exported file is saved. So this is the hyperlapse that the DJI Fly app creates for you. I always like to set this to 4K so that I can get the highest resolution file possible. I also like to save my raw DNG files because as good as the file is that the DJI Fly app spits out, we're going to get a lot more mileage out of those raw files. Just make sure that you have a micro SD card inserted that can accommodate a larger collection of photos, especially if your interval is set to a lower time. We're going to end up capturing hundreds of photos with these hyperlapses. So now that we're properly saving our files, it's time to plan our flights, and there's 4 different options that we can choose from: free, circle, course lock, and waypoints. So the first available option is free, and you can probably guess how this works. It allows you to fly the drone on your own at a predetermined speed, with the maximum limit being 6.7 miles per hour, while the camera captures pictures in your interval of choice that are then turned into a hyperlapse. You can also choose how long you want this hyperlapse to be. Now, there are essentially 3 different ways that you can use the free hyperlapse mode. You can let the drone sit there in place to create a stationary time lapse. You can move the sticks and gimbal to the maximum speed that you set with deadened control, so the drone doesn't move as fast and your final product will look nice and smooth. And finally, you can actually highlight a subject almost like you'd do with Spotlight in Focus Track and move the drone around in any direction you want as it stays focused on the subject that you've selected. Now, I think that having the option to freely fly your drone while capturing a hyperlapse is a must, and I think it's great that it's there. Again, as I mentioned, it's highly customizable, highly functional because of everything that you can do with it, but I just think that you need a lot of patience to go through and freely fly your drone for 40 minutes while capturing a long hyperlapse. I think it's very time consuming, and again, also a little bit exhausting because you're on the sticks for the entire time. I would much rather use the other flight modes, which are pretty much all automated. Now, moving on here, circle is probably my second favorite hyperlapse flight mode because of how easy it is to set up. You simply drag a box over the subject that you want to orbit, choose your interval or the frequency that the drone takes photos, choose the overall length of your hyperlapse, select the drone's speed, and finally choose your direction, either clockwise or counterclockwise. The drone will do a quick scan by rotating around to better determine the subject and then begin shooting. So yeah, circle is really easy to set up. That's probably what makes it my second favorite flight feature. I do wish it was a little bit more dynamic in a sense. I mean, sometimes rather than just orbiting around a subject, I'd rather add a little bit of like an elevation change, so maybe increase my altitude and pitch the gimbal down. So giving us more finite controls over what the drone does would be a great touch, but nonetheless, POI, or circle in this case, really is one of my favorite flight features because of, again, just totally how easy it is to use. Now, just as a quick tip, when choosing your subject, I'd recommend making your orbit or subject target larger than you need. To give you an example, when orbiting a city skyline, I would select the entire skyline rather than just a building. This will make the rotation a lot more smooth and keep your subject in the frame, whereas selecting a smaller subject might cause the drone to drift off and lose the subject that you've selected. Now, probably my all-time favorite hyperlapse flight planning mode that we have is course lock, which locks the drone in a straight flight path and flies along that line while capturing photos to, of course, be stitched together for your hyperlapse. You can lock your drone's course by pointing the front of your drone in the direction that you want to fly and then selecting the lock button just above the hyperlapse setting. So once it's locked, the lock should turn a yellow color. Tapping on the map in the bottom left corner is a great way to determine the flight path so you can better understand where your drone will be flying. Once that course is all set, then you're free to rotate your drone around to face in any direction that you want. The drone will still fly along that green line that is displayed on the map. From here, like always, you can select the drone's interval, the overall length of your hyperlapse, and of course the speed that you want your drone to fly. Just as a quick tip, I typically set my hyperlapse length to the maximum time of 30 seconds, which comes out to be 750 total photos, just so that I can let the drone run through and capture as many photos as it can. If I want, I can always chop off the ending or even the beginning of the hyperlapse. So yeah, much like circle, this is one of my favorite flight features just because of of how easy it is to use. You just set your course, rotate the drone in any direction you want to capture photos, and then go. The reason I think I like course lock more than circle is because it's a little bit more finite and precise. Sometimes with circle, it loses its subject and it'll end up doing a rotation and then the subject falls out of frame. But with course lock, it is so finite, it's so dead on. It's just like, hey, I'm gonna fly a straight line on this course and capture these photos. And you get a really high level of customization by being able to point the drone in any direction that you want and the gimbal in any direction that you want. But I do wish that over time, as the drone flew on its course, you could slowly raise or lower the altitude. I think that that would make it much more dynamic, like I said, with circle. Now, everything that I just mentioned that would potentially make course lock and circle better with changing the drone's altitude and adjusting the camera's pitch can be achieved through waypoints. So this, in theory, is the most customizable hyperlapse flight mode function. You can add a bunch of waypoints that remember your drone's position, height, and gimbal pitch. So as the drone flies from point to point, it will gradually make the adjustment, giving you a smooth hyperlapse. Once you have your entire flight set up with all of your waypoints set, you can adjust the interval and the length that you want the hyperlapse to be. You can even run your mission forwards or backwards depending on how you've set it up, which is a nice option to have. So waypoints is definitely the flight mode where you're going to want to exercise the tip that I shared with you in the beginning of the video by setting up all your waypoints, planning your flight, landing, and then taking off with a fresh battery to actually go through and execute that mission, because you might drain 25 to 30% of your battery flying around setting those waypoints to the point where you might not even be able to finish the mission because you only have so much battery. And so waypoints is definitely highly customizable. It's a great flight function to use within the hyperlapse flight feature, but it has one glaring issue where the drone, when you set the waypoints, basically just doesn't remember the height that you set whatsoever. For example, I set up this mission with two total waypoints, the first one at 250 feet and the next one at 350 feet. When I land the drone and try to repeat the waypoint mission, the drone flies to the first waypoint, and instead of going to the 250 feet that I set, it flies to 260 feet, so 10 feet higher than I had originally planned. I've had instances in the past where the height is off as much as 50 feet, which is totally unacceptable. It's a shame because I would use waypoints primarily, probably even over course lock because of the higher level of customization, but its unreliability completely kills that for me. Now, before we get into some more tips and go over the editing portion or the post-production portion of our hyperlapse tutorial, I want to give a quick shout out to our sponsor, Squarespace. Squarespace is a platform that I've personally been using before I even started posting videos here to my YouTube channel 6 years ago. I first built my portfolio using Squarespace's platform because of their templates that are stylish, functional, and easy to customize. I didn't need to learn how to code, I didn't need any previous experience, and I didn't need to spend an exorbitant amount of money to hire someone to build it from scratch. Instead, I'm able to work at my own pace, add my best photographs from my hard drive, and customize my template exactly the way that I want. In my case, I have a simple design with a black background and minimal text to keep the focus on the images. Squarespace goes even deeper with detailed analytics so I can see who's looking at my website. They have integrated SEO tools so that I can get my work seen by more people online, and if I choose to do so, I can even start an online store right within Squarespace's platform to sell prints, presets, or anything else photography related. So thanks to Squarespace for sponsoring this video and helping me display my work online for over half a decade. Okay, moving on here to one of the final portions of our hyperlapse tutorial, a quick tip regarding ND filters. If you're going to be taking a hyperlapse during the day, I'd always recommend using at least some form of neutral density filter so that you can exaggerate the motion in your frame. If instead you use no ND filter and your shutter speed is set to say 1/2000th, then you're going to get a very stop motion looking hyperlapse. I mean, you're not going to get much motion blur. It still looks awesome, but adding that level of motion blur definitely makes it look better. So you could try and go with, say, an ND32 filter to get your shutter speed around 1/60th. That's going to give you a very even looking motion blur, almost like it looks like you're actually capturing a video. But then from there, if you want to really exaggerate that motion on the ground, go with a much higher neutral density filter, something like an ND256 or 512, because that's going to give you a really cool look. Adding a filter this dark will lower your shutter speed substantially, adding motion blur to, say, the cars moving on the ground or the clouds moving through the sky in your hyperlapses. I try to keep my shutter speed around 1/8 or 1/4 of a second, as if you go any lower, you might get blurry images, so you don't want to slow your shutter speed down too slow because remember, your drone is still moving. With that said, I'd also recommend using an overall slower speed and a higher interval so the drone moves slower and takes photos fast. This will give you a really crisp looking hyperlapse with a little bit of pop. Okay, so now moving on to the final portion of our video, the post-production process, the editing process of the hyperlapse that we just captured. Now, I will be the first person to say that my process is fairly clunky, but I haven't found a way to streamline it. I mean, you're taking hundreds of photos, editing them, turning it into a short video. There's going to be a lot of little steps here, but I'll try to keep it as general as possible. So no matter which type of software that you use for both photo and video editing, you can try to implement my process into your own workflow. Now, also remember, we do get an exported version of our hyperlapse directly from the DJI Fly app, so you could almost skip a lot of the process that I'm about to show you and just use that one that the Fly app gave you, that it exported for you. But let me show you a quick side-by-side of the one that the Fly app made for me and one that I made on my own from those raw photos. There's just so much more depth in the video, much better quality, the colors look better. I was able to bring out some of the exposure in the sky, and it's also more stable. Now, there certainly is nothing wrong with sharing that file that's exported from the Fly application. It's still plenty stable. The video still looks good. You could still tweak the colors and the exposure if you wanted to, but I like to have better control over my images. So therefore, I'm going to show you the process now that I go through in order to edit all of the photos and then turn it into a short little hyperlapse. Now remember, this is more of a process thing here, so I want to give you a top-down view of what I'm doing here when editing my hyperlapses. I won't get into specifics like how to edit your photos in Lightroom. That is for another day, but instead today, we're pretty much going to talk about how to assemble your hyperlapse. So first things first, when I dump all of the images off of the drone onto my computer, regardless of what my plan is to share the hyperlapse, I always save the video file that the Fly application has made for me, and I save all of the raw photos to my hard drive. Now, once all of the files are on my computer, I'll import the photos into Lightroom and batch edit them. So I edit the first photo, copy my settings, and then paste those same settings throughout the entire collection. And just as a quick reference, I'm using the cloud version of Lightroom here. Now, chances are everything about the images will be the same, so the edits will be the same across the board, and all the photos will look nice with those edits made, but make sure you flip through the images and there isn't a glaring difference between the edits on, say, the front half and the back half of your hyperlapse. Because remember, during your flight, there could be something that changes about the photos that makes one set of edits not look good on another set of photos. So let's say a cloud cover rolls in and you have a different white balance, you might need to make that adjustment. Another example is if you're flying, say, during a sunset, and as the sun goes down, you continue to lose light, you might need to edit the photos on the back end of your hyperlapse just a little bit differently. Now, after editing the photos, we'll export them so that they are full-sized JPEGs. Then we'll bring them into our video editing software. So in this case, I'm using Final Cut Pro. I like to first start by making a project that is the same size as the photos themselves. So in this case of this vertical hyperlapse, the image size is 3024 by 4032. This allows us to combine all the images into a single compound clip and then retime that clip to speed up the motion to say 10 or 15 seconds, but we aren't finished yet because in its current state, the video is fairly jumpy. So we want to add some stabilization, but the only issue is that with Final Cut Pro, you aren't able to stabilize a compound clip. This means that we need to export the file in its current state and then bring it back into Final Cut Pro so it recognizes it as a video file. Once we've done that, I like to then create a fresh project in the aspect ratio that I want to share my hyperlapse in. In this case, I'll be uploading this hyperlapse as a reel on Instagram, so I'll go with a 4K vertical aspect ratio. That would be 2160 by 3840. Now that we have this short video file, we can add stabilization to it, and the difference is huge. Specifically with this clip, it was very jumpy before, but now it looks completely stable. Sometimes it takes a little bit of effort to get the stabilization to work, especially in Final Cut Pro. I always try and experiment with the different stabilization algorithms like inertia cam and smooth cam. Sometimes I even go as far as stabilizing it, exporting it, and then bringing it back through Final Cut Pro for a second round of stabilization, but that's usually reserved for the very windy days. Now from here, it's up to you to make this hyperlapse your own. You could always duplicate the video file and almost create like a boomerang out of it, but I'll leave those creative decisions up to you guys for your own. Now, as I said, I know that this workflow can seem clunky, jumping around from different softwares and exporting clips only to re-import them, but it works for me and helps me get the best results from my hyperlapse. If you look on the left side of the screen, there is a list of things that I do throughout my process, so you can make a mental note of the things that you need to do when editing your own hyperlapse. And so guys, there we have it. That is how we create a hyperlapse with our Mini 3 Pro from start to finish. I know that it is a very lengthy process. There are some things that you could probably cut out to make it a little bit easier, but again, I try to go the extra mile to make sure that my hyperlapses are nice, smooth, stable, the colors look good, and that's why we had to go through that long editing process. If you have any questions, please feel free to leave them down in the comment section below. And as always, I'll talk to you later. Peace.